Welcome everyone to part 3 of this tutorial, and in this part we are finally going to start coding our WebSocket programming. So we need both the client side of WebSockets and server side WebSockets as well. Therefore we need two files. So I have already created two files. This one is called clientscript.js and the server side is called server.js, and this client script.js needs to be linked with our HTML file, so that's why I have put it over here, this script at the end of our HTML file. The source attribute of the script element refers to our client script.js file, and I have put this keyword defer along with it. This defer, what does it do? It makes sure that our JavaScript file is loaded after our HTML has been loaded. Otherwise, there is always a possibility that JavaScript tries to manipulate HTML elements through the DOM which haven't yet been loaded in the memory. So it can refer to elements which does not exist at that point, so it can create unforeseen circumstances, as you can understand. Therefore it is always a good idea to put defer whenever you link your JavaScript file to your HTML file. Okay, so let me save and close it. Now I'm going to open this client side file, and I'm going to open this server side file side by side, because we will be coding into these two files simultaneously, so that you can understand easily which part of client side is communicating with which part of the server side is WebSockets. So it's much easier this way. Okay, so before we start coding, we need to install two packages for our server side WebSockets. So we need these two packages because we are going to create a server from scratch, whereas when it comes to client side WebSocket, our browsers have already built-in WebSocket API implemented in them. So all we need to do is create an object of WebSocket in the client side, but for server side we have to install two packages which are needed for us to create a server from scratch. So let me install those packages first. Npm install. The first one is HTTP and the second one is npm install WebSocket. Okay, now let's I have already commented out the initial steps that we need to code into our client and server side files. So for the client side, we just have to create a new instance of WebSocket, and we have to pass along the URL and the port number of the server where we believe our WebSocket server is running. And after that, we have to do basically two jobs. To send a message to the server, we have to use this send message, which is again provided by default in our WebSocket API implementation of our browser. And whenever the server sends a message to the client, an event in the WebSocket is triggered, which is called onMessage event. And whenever this message is triggered, we need to have an event listener associated with it. That event listener is going to be executed. Within this event listener, we are going to program what we want to happen next, or how do we want our user interface to update, and how do we want our game to progress further. Now when it comes to server side programming, because we have to create everything from scratch, the first thing that we need to do is we have to create a HTTP server. We need a HTTP server because WebSocket server cannot exist on its own. It always kind of sits on top of a HTTP server. So we need to have an HTTP server, and then we are going to pass along that HTTP server to the constructor of WebSocket. And once we get WebSocket object created, now we need to wait for any request from the client side, and the first ever request that comes from the client side is basically a request to upgrade HTTP protocol to WebSocket protocol, and this means it is a formal request by the client that they want to initiate a two-way communication between client and server based on WebSocket protocols. And once that upgradation has occurred successfully, next, just like client, we have a message named send to send a message to the client, and then whenever a message is received from the client, an event called onRequest is triggered, but not on the WebSocket object itself, but instead on a connection object which is created once our WebSocket object accepts the request of upgradation from HTTP to WebSockets. So then it returns a connection object, and that connection object actually uniquely identifies the particular client which has made that request. So let's start with our client side first. We need a variable called, we are going to call it socket, and new WebSocket, and we have to pass along a string which basically represents the URL and port number where our WebSocket server is listening. Because it's a WebSocket based protocol, so instead of HTTP we have to use WS. Then our server is localhost and the colon, and then 8080 is the port. It will create an object of type WebSocket, and it will also send a request to the server that will basically ask the server to upgrade HTTP protocol to WebSocket protocol. And if this request is successful, the server will respond back with a message. So because it is a message from the server, that means in our client side this socket object's on message event is going to get triggered. So we should define an event listener and handle that request as well. So we'll say socket.on message. Now this is again built-in event with our client side WebSocket API, but on the right side we have to define an event listener. So we are going to name it on message as well with capital M, and we have to now define this on message function or event handler. So function on message, and this on message is going to get passed the reply object which is sent from the server. So we can call it anything we like. Because it is a message from the server, we are going to call it MSG, and we are going to keep this function empty for the time being. Later on we will obviously further define this function. Now the thing is this: if we put these two lines of code just the way it is, what it will do, the instant our JavaScript file is loaded into the memory, that is when the browser opens, it will instantly send a request to the server, and we don't want that to happen. The user interface we have defined is that once we click on this connect button, only then this request should go to the server, not before that. Therefore we have to put these two lines of code within the event listener of this connect button. So we are going to define an event listener for this connect button, and within that event listener we should put these two lines so that this activity happens the moment anyone clicks on the connect button. So we are going to cut it, and now we need a reference variable which refers to our connect button in the DOM. Const connect equals document dot query selector, and because the connect button has a class called .cntbtn, so we will use that class. Okay, once we get this reference to our connect button, now we can define an add event listener, and the particular event we are interested in is click event, and here we have to define event listener. So we can use a function, and later on this define function over here, or we can use an arrow function. So we are going for arrow function because it's practically 2 or 3 lines of code. Okay, so within the body of this arrow function we are pasting those 2 lines that we had defined earlier. Okay, so now what will happen is the moment our connect button is clicked, this request to create a new WebSocket connection with a server is sent to the server. Okay, the next thing that we want should happen is that once we get connected with the server, there is no point for us to be able to have this facility to click on the connect button because we are already connected. So we want to disable that activity once we have already performed this activity. So to do that, we need the object that represents that event that get triggered. So we need to have that object that represents the event passed along to our event listener. So we are going to call it source, src. Now source, the target of the source, which is the connect button itself, and we want its we want it to be disabled. So we'll say dot disabled equals true. And now let's see how it works in our browser. Remember, we don't have any server listening at port 8080, so obviously we are going to get an error, but we should be able to see at least the connect button gets disabled once we click on this connect button. So let's see if it works. So I'm going to use the live server. Okay, so let's try to connect it. Okay, now you saw. Okay, so we've got an error. Firefox cannot establish a connection to the server at this location. That's because there isn't any server at the moment. But the point is, once we clicked on this connect button, now this connect button has got disabled. So this is the activity that I was interested in showing you. Now we have to go to our server side and we have to code it such that it is able to listen on this address and accept the request and a response back to the client with client ID. First of all, we need a variable which is going to refer to our HTTP package. Because a package are module, so we are going to say require, and within this require we need to name the particular package we are interested in, which is HTTP. And once we get this HTTP, HTTP, now we have to use its create server method. This is going to create an HTTP server, and the next one is we are going to make it listen on port 8080. Listen. So listen takes two parameters. First one is the port. Second one could be a message which will help us to be certain whether our server has started and is it running on this particular port or not. So we'll say console.log and we can listening on port 8080. Now we've got HTTP server running and listening on the port. Now we need a WebSocket object. Server is, again, we have to refer to our package that we just installed, which is WebSocket. Now this WebSocket package has many classes. We are in particular interested in only server package. So once we get this server package, now we can create a WebSocket. We can say const socket equals, so here's a new, and we have to use this variable because it refers to our server class from our WebSocket package. So we are going to say new server, and as a parameter, what do we need to pass to this one? We need to pass along an object, and the only thing that this object is supposed to have is our HTTP server. So it's so the name of this attribute is going to be HTTP server. Now this is a case sensitive attribute, so you have to write this HTTP server the way I have written, and as its value we have to pass along the HTTP server that we just created, which is HTTP as well. So that's it. Now our WebSocket server is created. Now the next thing that we need to do is we have to define an event listener for one of its events called the request event. So this request will be upgradation from HTTP to WebSocket protocol. So we'll say socket.on, and as a parameter to this on method, the first one is going to be the particular event that we want to define an event handler for. So in this case, it's the request event. So this request event basically refers client's request for the upgradation from HTTP to the WebSocket. And as an event listener, we can define a function over here or an arrow function. So again, it's because it's just a few lines of code, so we are going for arrow function. Now we need to pass along all the request details that has been sent from the client to this arrow function. So we are going to call this parameter request as well, or EQ. So within the body of this event request event handler, what does our socket is supposed to do? It's supposed to accept this request, which in turn will return us a connection with this client. And once we get this connection, we have to somehow securely store this connection so that later on, when this particular client sends a message, our server is able to identify the client uniquely, because a server handles multiple clients at a time. So a server should be able to differentiate between these clients. Otherwise, it might send response of one client's request to some other client. So we need a connection variable, and this connection variable is going to store the connection object returned from our accept method. So we'll say the client's request dot accept, and this accept method requires two parameters. The first one is the particular WebSocket protocol that the server will only accept. Since we are not particular about any WebSocket protocol, so we are putting the word null here. It means this server is not very picky about the particular WebSocket protocol. And second one is whether we want to restrict the client request to come from certain region, and we want to restrain other parts or some other criteria. Again, we are not picky about it, so we are going to say wherever the request has come from, accept it. And the way to say wherever the client request has come from, we'll say request.origin. That means this, whatever the origin of this request is, accept that request. Okay, so this will give us a connection. Now at this point, server is supposed to respond back to the client, informing it that the connection has been successfully created between the client and the server. And because we expect this client to get a unique client ID, so therefore at this particular moment our server must create a unique client ID and send that client ID to the client. The client ID should be unique, otherwise we are going to get into the trouble of having different clients with same client ID, and we might be again confused which client belongs to which connection. We don't want that to happen, so our client ID must be unique. And there are different ways you can make your client ID unique, but because our code is already complicated, so I'm going to go for the very simplest unique client ID, which might not be unique client ID, but hopefully for our demonstration purpose it is going to stay unique. So we have to create another variable called client ID, and we are going to use JavaScript's maths.random method. Now this maths.random method returns a decimal value ranging between 0 and 1. So it is 0 or greater than 0 up to but less than 1. So it could be 0.0, 0.05, 0.01 or 0.0009, could be anything but less than 1. So when we get that, and if we multiply it by 10, what will happen is, let's suppose it will give us a unique, it will make the integer part multiple of 10. So it will give us a number in the range of 0 up to 9. Again, it's going to have some decimal part as well, but because of multiplying it by 10, it gives us a value between 0 up to 9, 9.5 or anything, but up to 9. And if you multiply it by 10, it is going to give us a value between 0 up to 99. So you got the idea. So I'm only interested in one digit, and when we get a one digit with the decimal part, now we have to get rid of this decimal part. So I'm going to put all of this within math.round function. Now as a result, this whole thing will give us one digit integer value, and we want at least 3 digits client ID, so we have to put plus control V plus control V. Now this will make sure that each time our client ID consists of 3 digits. Now we have got the connection, unique connection referring to this client ID and unique client ID. So we have to send this client ID to our client, but before doing that we have to make sure that we store these two pieces of information in our global data structure. If we don't do that, what will happen is that the moment another request comes to the client will overwrite, create a new connection for the new client and overwrite the previous connection. As a result, the previous connection which refers to this client will get lost, and the previous client's client ID will also get lost. But we don't want that to happen. Therefore, once we get these two pieces of information, we have to store it some other global data structure. So to do that, first of all, we have to define a global data structure. So we are going to say var, and because they represents clients, so it's a clients plural, and in the beginning it's going to be an empty object. Okay, so later on we will keep filling on this client's data structure, which is an object itself. It's going to have multiple objects as its members, something like that. Okay, and each client, we want to identify each of these objects uniquely using this client ID, just like index-based arrays. And to do that, what we have to do, we have to say clients square brackets, and within this square brackets, if we want to uniquely identify this client with this client ID, so we have to put that client ID variable over here, and now we have to define the actual object. So with this actual object, within this object, the only piece of information that we want to store is the connection. So basically it has one attribute called connection. I can give it any name I like, but I prefer to keep it same as our actual connection variable and the variable itself. Okay, so now this particular connection is uniquely stored in an object which could be identified with the client object, and it's stored in our client's data structure. This client data structure is global. That means we can refer to this data structure from different methods throughout our server file. Once we done this part, now what we need to do, we have to send a message to the client. Now, as we discussed earlier, the only way to send a message to the client is this send method. And because we have created a unique connection with the client, so the send message actually is part of the connection object, not the socket object. So we'll say connection.send, and as a parameter we have to pass on the object that we want to send. But because we have to send that data along the transmission line, so that means our data must be in the format that our transmission line could handle it. And there are different data transmission protocols such as XML and JSON. We are interested in JSON because it closely relates to our JavaScript objects, and our data is text-based, and JSON is very good with handling text-based data. We have to call JSON function dot stringify because we are encapsulating our normal JavaScript data into JSON data. So within this stringify, we are passing along the object, and this object basically connects only this piece of information, client ID. So because we have to translate into JSON form, so we have to say key value pair style client ID. So this is the key, and here we have to write actual value, which is client ID. We are good to send this information to the client, but the problem here is because we have only one method called send to send all the different kinds of messages to the client, and client has to take actions based on those different messages. So based on each message, client will take a different action. But if we have only one method called send to send the data, how will our client be able to distinguish between different messages? So that means within the data itself, we have to kind of put some sort of tag which is going to help our client to distinguish between the kind of message sent by the server. So because it's a tag, we are going to name it tag as well, and the value of tag is going to be, could be anything as long as it's unique and our client is able to uniquely identify as well. So we'll say we are basically informing the client that you are connected to the server. So that's why the value of tag in this particular case is connected. Okay, now let's move on to client side. So when this message is received by this client, the socket.on message event is triggered, and when this event gets triggered, this on message starts executing. So we have to now do our coding within this on message, that how to handle this data. Because this is a message to the client from the server, so the variable or the parameter name that we are using, which is going to represent all this information by the server, we are going to call it as message as well, MSG, because it is a message from the server. Okay, so once we get this message which represents the server's message to the client, now we have to basically strip off all the unrelevant information such as headers and other things, and we are only interested in these two pieces of information that is sent to the server, to the client. To do that, again, let's create a variable. Let's call it data, and from this message object is going to have many different fields, each representing different aspect of the server information, but we are interested in the actual data sent from the server. So each object which is received by the client has a field called data. So this data is actually stored in .data field in the object which is sent by the server. So once we got this data, but the problem is that when we are sending the data, we had encapsulated it in our JSON format. Now we have to remove this packaging of our data. So again, we have to put this thing inside the counterpart of JSON.stringify, which is .parse. Okay, now our data is parsed and is in the normal JavaScript format and is stored in our local variable called data. Now once we got the data, we know that this data consists of only two fields. One is called tag and another is client ID. So we have to basically, up to this point, every message is going to be the same. From that point onwards, we have to distinguish between different messages based on this tag information. So we are going to use the switch statement, and we are going to pass along data dot tag, and we say if the tag is connected, whatever we want to happen next is going to be put here. So for the time being, all we want a message in the console which just displays us our client ID, which is data dot client ID. So let's hope we haven't done any mistake and it works. Okay, let's say connect. Oh, we haven't started our server yet. So our server is server.js, so we have to say node server.js. So now our server is listening on port 800. Now refresh it, connect. The connection to the WS was interrupted by the, okay, there is something wrong. Okay, client ID, spelling mistake. Let's restart the server, refresh, connect, undefined. So we have, okay, again problem in our mistake. It's actually client ID. Now let's give it another try, connect. Okay, now can you see 5 over here? That means we have successfully connected with the server and successfully requested to upgrade to the WebSockets. The server created a unique client ID. So give it one more go, connect. Now we've got an ID of 24. Now the next thing is that instead of generating this 24 in the console, we want to create a new label, and the text of that label should be this, whatever the client ID is, and this label should get attached over here in the menu bar as the first ever element in the menu of this menu bar. So this is our next task. We are going to attach this new label as the first child in the sidebar div. So we need a reference to our sidebar. So const sidebar equals document dot query selector, and the sidebar, the class that we have given to this sidebar div is sidebar as well. So we'll say dot sidebar. Now we have a reference to our sidebar. Now within this connected case, we have to create a new label. So we'll say const label equals document dot query selector, and we want a label, so we'll write label full spellings because it's an HTML element label. Now we want the text of the label to be this client ID, so we'll say lbl label dot inner text equals data dot client ID. Now we want this text to be centrally aligned, so we'll say label dot style dot text align is center. Now we have properly created a label and formatted it as well, but we haven't yet inserted it in our sidebar. So we have to insert this label as one of its children in the sidebar. And we also have to specify the position, that where do we want it to be positioned. So we want it to be the very first element or very first child of the sidebar. So that means we have to place it before connect button. So we'll say sidebar dot insert before, and insert before takes two parameters. First one is the element that we want to insert, and the second is before which element do you want to insert this new element. So we want it to come before connect button, so we'll write connect over here. Now our label gets inserted in the sidebar, so let's see if it works. Refresh, connect. We've got something wrong. Okay, so it should be document. Let's give it another try. Connect, NT. So we saw the 18 over here, and new label which comes before the connect button, and the text is centrally aligned as well. So this is what we wanted. So we have to remove this. We have removed the console statement. Now we want to store this client ID in the client's global variable as well, so that we don't lose the client's ID. So we need a global variable client ID, and because it's global, we can access it from within our event listener. So we say client ID equals data dot client ID. So now our client's own variables stores the client ID sent by the server as well. Next thing that we need to do is that in the beginning you can say the connect button is enabled, and so are create and join as well. So create button basically sends a request to the server to create a new game, and the join is supposed to send a request to join one of the games available here. So that means when we are not connected to the WebSocket server, at that time we should not have this functionality to be able to create or join either. So that means when this user interface loads in the memory, the only button that should be enabled is connect. Create and join should be disabled. So we have to make these changes. So we have a reference to the connect button, so now we need references to create and join buttons as well. Const create is document dot query selector, and the class that we have given to our create button is .crtbtn, and we have to, when we open the browser, our create button must be disabled. So we'll say create dot disabled equals true. Now we need another variable for join button as well. Document dot query selector, and what was the class name that we had given to our join button? That was join. Okay, now we have to disable join button as well. Dot disabled true. Okay, now let's go back to our connected case, and once we get connected and we get a client ID, at this point what should happen next is that the create and join button should get enabled. So we'll say create dot disabled equals false and join dot disabled equals false. So let's see if it works. Connect. Nope. The join is null. Okay. So let's open our client.html file and verify the name, class name we have given to the join button. Oh, that's JNBTN. Okay. Let's see. So at the beginning, create and join are disabled, only connect is enabled. Let's click on connect. We get our client ID, and now create and join have been enabled. So this is what we wanted. Once we get connected to the server and get our client ID, the next message that should come from the server is list of those games which have been already created by different players, but they are waiting for player number 2 to join and start the game. So the new coming client should get those list of games, and as a consequence they should get displayed over here. So now we have to code that logic in our programs because the message is coming from the server. So that means once this message is sent where the client ID is being sent to the client, the second message should be the list of available games. So that means we are going to need another data structure which is going to hold all the information about the games that have been created. So that means we are going to have another data structure with the name of games. The information that this games data structure must have is the list of players. So because it's a list, so that means we are going to use an array of players. Then the board, which is going to represent these 9 cells on our board, that on each board, whether it's empty or player X has made its move or player Y had made its move there. And the third information is the game ID itself. So just like we are identifying each object in the client data structure by client ID, we are going to identify each object in the game data structure with the game ID. Okay. So right after the end of the first send message, we should call another function which is going to handle this sending game list to the clients. So let's call this function send available games. We don't need to pass any parameter. So the job of this send available games is that take all the games from this games data structure and filter out those games which only have one player and they are waiting for player 2 to join in. So send all those games to all the clients which are available in the client's data structure. So that's why we don't need to have any parameters for this one. So we are here just calling send available games and we have to define this function. Let's make it plural. Okay. For the time being, because we don't have any game available over here, so we are hard coding games to be an array with these 3 elements. This is game ID 1, this is game ID 3, and this is game ID 4. So we will change this thing later on, but for the time being, let's assume these are the games which have been created by different clients and they are waiting for player number 2 to join in. Okay, so once we have got our list of available games, we have to get all the clients from client data structure over here. So far, and because we have inserted at least one client in our client's data structure, so that means our client's data structure is not empty. Okay, we need to iterate over client's data structure and then to each of those clients send this games array in the send method. So we'll say for const client in clients. During each iteration, this client is going to extract client IDs from this client data structure. So we are going to utilize this client ID to again go inside client's data structure with this client representing the client ID and take its connection attribute, and on that connection attribute you have to send the data that you want to send to the client. And as we have discussed, this send data we have to encapsulate it or package it in JSON format. So for that we are going to use JSON.stringify, and which takes an object as a parameter. And in this object, the first thing is we have to make sure that this data, when it reaches the client, it is distinguished as a list of available games, so that the client side can take appropriate measures of displaying it in the games list. Therefore, we need to take this data so that it becomes unique. So the tag is going to be, let's call it games list. So this is its tag. Now the actual data we need to send is this list of available games that are waiting to be joined in. So the key that we are going to use, let's say list, and the value is going to be this games array. So all set. So once each client gets client ID, the second message gets immediately sent to the server, and this send message is basically going to provide the currently available games which are waiting for player 2 to join in. Those games are provided to the client. Now if we move on to our client side, as you can see, our client side is only handling the data that it receives when the client gets connected to the server. So now we need to define another case. So we have to first of all put a break over here. Now the second case is we have to use this tag, which is games list. So when the client receives a message which is tagged with this identity, then this is the part that should start executing. Now all we need to do is we want this games list to be populated with list items. So that means we need to create a reference variable which refers to our unordered list in our HTML DOM. So say const list document start query selector and UL, which is just one in our whole HTML code. So once we get access to this, now come here. Now because the list is actually an array, so that means we have to iterate over them. Again, let's say const games assign data dot list. Now we have to iterate over list using for each function. For each is a higher order function, and as a parameter we pass in an arrow function. So whatever we define inside the body of arrow function, that logic is going to be applied to each element in our, sorry, we need to put games here, in our games element. To that arrow function we have to pass on each element of this games element. So we are going to call it game, and here it is the body. So each element of games array is going to be referred to as game, and that game variable is passed as a parameter to our arrow function. So whatever logic we want to be applied to that element, we can provide that logic inside these curly brackets. Okay, so what do we want to do with each element of the games array? For each element of the game array, we want to create a list item and insert it into our unordered list. So before we start coding, I need to explain one more thing. So suppose we got connected to the server and we received a list of games. So what will happen if another player joins in and it gets connected, send available game message is going to be sent to every client which is connected to the server. So as a result, if this client has received all the games, let's suppose there were 3 games, and then another client comes in and gets connected to the server, again the send available game message is going to be called, and this client is going to get the list of available games twice. So if the list is 1, 3 and 4, and when new client joins in and again this client receives the send available games message. So again it will get the list 1, 3 and 4. If we keep on creating new list elements and keep adding to our unordered list, what will happen? Games list is going to be quite long and there is going to have lots of repetition as well. Likewise, when let's say another player comes in and instead of creating a new game, it joins one of the available games. Let's suppose player number 3 or client number 3, it joins game number 3. Now because game 3 has 2 players associated with it now, so it moves on from the waiting for the player state to in progress state. So the next time when the server sends the list of available games, this game number 3 should not be present over here. So the moment any player joins one of the games in the list, that game should be removed from this list. So that means for 2 different reasons, we need to keep on updating our unordered list all the time. Therefore, the first step is we have to make sure we remove all the list items from our unordered list which it currently has and start repopulating it with freshly provided list by the server, because that list is the most updated list and we don't want any repetition and we don't want those games in the list which have been assigned to players, so it's not waiting for any third player to join in. So every time the first step is when we get this message send available games, so this case part it should remove all the elements from the unordered list and then repopulate it with freshly created list items. So first part is while list has at least first child, you have to remove list dot remove child. You want to remove the last child. So as long as list has first child, remove the last element from the list. So this way we will never encounter a situation when a list does not have any children and we are still trying to remove its children. So first of all we are making sure that at least the list has one child, and then we are saying remove the last child. So when the list has only one child, the first child will and the last child will be the same element, and as a result that element will get removed, and then next time the while won't execute because it won't have any first child, so it won't enter into the body of the while loop. Okay, now we have removed all the elements from the list. Now we have to create new list items, add game ID as its inner text, and then add that list item as child to our list. So we are going to say const li equals document dot create element, and we want to create list item. So li, then li dot inner text equals data dot, sorry, not data dot game, but this variable game, then li dot style text align equals center. Okay, now what we need to do, we have created and styled our list item. Now we have to add that list item to our unordered list, which is list dot append child, and which is what, li. This is all we need to do. Save it and let's try to rerun it. Connect. Okay. Why do we only see just 4? It's because the code where we are removing the previously available list items, we have put it inside the for each loop. So what happens when the loop starts, it removes all the list items, then adds 1 to it, and then when the second iteration of the loop starts, again it removes all the elements. So as a result, game ID number 1 is also gets removed, and then again repopulates it with game ID 3, and on third iteration again it removes all the elements including the game ID number 3 and repopulates it, which is 4 this time. So we need to take this outside our for loop, put it over here, and let's give it another go. Connect, and now you can see we can see all the game IDs as our list items in our list. Okay, now what is the next step that we shall attempt? I think we should focus on creating a new game. When we click on the create button, so this is a communication which is initiated by the client. Remember, the send available games communication was initiated by the server. So create new game is going to be initiated by the client. That means it's not going to be in our switch statement. Instead, we have to put all that logic in our create button event handler. This is our create button. Now we have to define an event listener for our create button. So let's go down, create dot add event listener, and which event do we want to define our event listener for? That's obviously the click event. And for the event listener, we are going for arrow function because we hardly need 3 or 4 lines. So all we need to do here is that we have to send a message to the server with the client ID that this client ID wants to create a new game. So basically it is going to be just socket.send, and we have to again package our message inside JSON format. So we'll say JSON.stringify, and we have to pass in a message, and message contains nothing but the client ID. And the tag is going to be, let's say, create. So the first one is tag, and we are going to call it create. So when the server receives a message with create tag, it's an indication to the server that client wants new game to be created. Now the second part is which client wants new game. So that's why we have to send client ID. Okay, that's it, nothing else. Okay, when this message reaches server should be able to distinguish it. At the server side, it is basically the connection object on which this message is going to be received. So when this connection object receives a message, an event named message is triggered in our connection object. So where we have defined this connection object, okay, after calling our function send available games, we have to define new event for our connection. So we have to say connection.on, and here we have to define when any message is received on this connection, what shall happen. So the event that we are interested in is message. Remember, the first event that we have handled at the client side is request event, and this request event is triggered on socket object, whereas this message event is triggered on connection object. So on this connection object, message event is triggered. Here we have to define a event handler which is going to be executed each time an event is triggered. So again, on this server side, the event handler, we are going to give it name on message. So let's go down and define this on message function. We have to pass along all the information from the client side to this message, because it is actually the message that is being received from the client. So we are going to call this parameter message, and within this message again we have to define a variable. We are going to call it data, just like we did for our client side. And from this message object, it contains lots of different information, but we are interested in only the data sent by the client. So remember, the data sent by the server, when it reaches the client, it is called message.data like this. But at the server side, the object which is received by the server, which contains client's information, the data part of that object is actually called UTF-8 data. So we don't simply say data like we did when at this client side. We have to say UTF-8 data. And again, because it's encapsulated in a JSON format, so we have to parse it back into JavaScript object. So we'll say JSON.parse. Okay. Now, just like client side, we have to use switch statement based on the tag. So we'll say data dot tag, and the first case is going to be this tag create. So it's a request from the client to create a new game. Now here the server actually have to create a new game. Okay, now to create a new game, what information is needed? So we need a game ID, we need a list of players, and in the list of players, we need to have their player's ID, which is going to be the client ID of the player. We need the symbol of the player, and we also need whether it is player 1's turn or is it player 2's turn. So each player will have 3 pieces of information: is turn variable, which is going to be boolean, and its symbol in the client ID. Beside this player, the game has game board, which is going to be again an array of 9 elements from 0 to 8. Each element is going to represent one of the cells on our game board, and the third piece of information for each game is the game ID itself. So the first of all, we need to create the game ID. We are going to create the game ID based on the same logic that we use for creating client ID. So we are going to say const game ID is math.round times 100, and then we have to maths.random, and here maths.round, and we need 3 digits at least. So copy, paste. Okay, this is game ID. Now we need a game board as well. Let's define the board over here. So we'll say const board. Now this board is going to be an array with 9 elements, and they are all going to be empty strings. Okay, so this is game board. Now we need an array of players, and each player is going to be an object with its own list of elements. So let's define a player first. So player consists of client ID, symbol, and is turn. So we'll start with client ID. Now the client ID comes from this data.client ID, because this message, create message from the client side, has only sent one piece of information, which is this client ID beside the tag. So we can get it from data.client ID. Okay, the second piece is, this one requires a T. The second piece is the symbol. So let's say the first player always gets the symbol X, and the third piece is it whose turn is it? Is it player 1's turn when the game starts, or is it player 2's turn? So we need an is player variable, and let's set it to true. Okay, so this is player, but we need an array of players for our game's data structure, not one player, because each game is going to have 2 players. So now we are going to create players, const players array, and we have to pass on our single player. So now players is a array with currently 1 player. When we define our join functionality, in that functionality will define same player like this one, all these pieces of information, and then we'll append that player to this players array. Okay, now we have got all 3 pieces of information. All we have to do is that store these 3 pieces of information in our game's data structure and as an object, and that object is going to be uniquely identified with this game ID. Okay, so we'll say games, game ID is an object with a key called board, and its value is this board variable. And then another key called players, and the value of these players is this players array. Okay, we don't need to store this games ID inside the object because this object is uniquely identified through this game ID. Okay, now we have stored all this information in our games data structure over here. Now all we need to do is send that game ID to the client who had requested for the creation of that game. So what we need to do is that we have to find out the connection of that client. So we have to use our client's data structure, and from there we have to use data.client ID. So this data.client ID is going to give us the client ID of the client which has requested new game creation, and using that client ID we will figure out the actual object in the client's data structure, and from there we will extract this connection, and using that connection we are going to send the message back to the client. And again we have to use json.stringify, and we have to pass along an object, and within this object we have to pass along key value pairs. So and the first one is going to be tag as usual, and this will simply inform the client that the game has been created. So the tag is called created, and the second information should be game ID, so that the client know the game ID which has been created on behalf of the client. Now when this message arrives at the client part, our client should be able to catch it, and okay, this was our case game list. So break. Okay, now we need to capture this message with the created tag. So the tag is created, and in this one we simply have to do just one thing. We have to define a global variable game ID, and the game ID that we receive from the server, we have to store that game ID in the client's own variable game ID. So game ID equals data dot game ID. So at this point I think it's a good idea that we disable the join button, because once you have created your own game, you should not have this possibility to join another game. You should wait for some player to join your own game. So we are going to disable both create and join buttons. So we'll say create dot disables true, and then join dot disabled also true. That's it, nothing else in our created case. Let me put break. Okay, and just to be certain that we have actually received the game ID from the server, let's print it on the console, game ID. Let's stop the server and restart it. Now let's see, connect. Okay, create. So we've got an error, socket is not defined on line 64. Okay, Okay, it says socket is not defined. It's because remember we moved these two lines of code inside the event listener of connect button. So this makes socket only visible to this event listener. And if we want to make this socket to be global, we have to remove this var from here and we have to take it outside this. And let's define this with the rest of the variable. Var socket. Now our socket is a global variable. Now it should be accessible from line 64 as well. Here, it should be also visible over here. So let's give it another go. Connect, create. Now what's the message? Console is not a function. 55 spelling mistake. So not spelling, we have forgotten to write .log 55. Okay, console.log. Okay, connect, create. Okay, now create got disabled. Join has also been disabled, and you can see 188 is the game ID, 155 is the client ID, and 188 is the game ID. Okay, so far so good. Now that we have stored some information in our games data structure, so we have to go back to our send available games function here, and remember we have hard coded the games list over here. Now we have to change this, and we have to make sure now whatever information is in this games data structure, so we are going to loop through those games. If any game does not have more than one player, we are going to send the list of all those games to every client who is currently connected to the server. And to do that, we have to define a variable, local variable. Let's call it games list. Okay, and now we have to loop through our games data structure. So we'll say for const game in games. So now this game actually represents each element of games data structure, and we will look at the players array in each game ID, and if the size of that players array is less than 2, that means that game is waiting for a second player to join in. So we will add those IDs to this games list array, and at the end we will send that variable games list in our message over here. So we have to check if game dot players dot length is less than 2. In that case, we have to games list dot push game. So this for loop iterates over games objects, and because each object is identified by a game ID, so here this variable game is storing just the ID of each object. So when we enter into the for's body, then we are again using this games data structure and now passing on the ID. So that is going to help us extract the whole object, and from that whole object we are referring to the players field of that object. And we are, because we know players is an array, so we are using the length property of the array. So if the length is less than 2, that means that game is waiting for player number 2 to join in. So then we are pushing that ID into our games list variable over here, okay, which is an array. So let me make it an array. So now this is an empty array, so this games list is an array for sure. And now when we push it, so each game ID it becomes an element in our array. So at the end of the iteration, we have this games list populated with those game IDs who have only one member so far, one player so far. So now all we need to do is that replace this games variable with games list variable. Now let's see if it works. So we have to shut our server and restart the server. Now if all goes smoothly, it should only display just one game ID over here, which is going to be created by this client. Now let's try. So let's connect. So now we are connected with the ID 196. So let's create. A new ID has been created, but we don't see it in the list over here. That's because when a new game is created and we want it to be displayed in the list of available games, so that means we have to call send available games function again. Connect, create. Now we can see the game ID over here as well. So we have to remove this console.log message, but there is one unexpected change that I have noticed. If you see the label which was showing available games, it has disappeared as well. The reason is that when we are connected with the server and we received a message from the server that we are connected with it, at that point, what we were supposed to do, we were supposed to create a new label, insert client ID as its text, and append that label into our sidebar. But instead of creating a new label over here, what I have done is that I have actually referenced the label which is already present in our HTML, which was referring to available games text. So we were not supposed to use query selector over here. We were supposed to say create element over here. So this will create a new label, and that label will be inserted, and the previous label, the initial one which says available games, that is not going to be touched anymore. So let's give it another try. Let's shut our server and restart it. So connect. Okay, now since there aren't any games, so available games is empty. Now let's create one game. Now you can see we can see the game which was created on our request, which is 166. You can see being displayed over here. And now since we are connected, so the connected is disabled. We have already created a game, so create is disabled, and since we have created our own game, so it doesn't make sense to now join someone else's game to play. So that's why the join has been disabled as well. Now if we open another browser as a client 2, now the moment this client gets connected to the server, it will see the same game ID created by player 1, which is 166 over here. So let's connect. The moment it got connected, this is the player 2's ID, sorry, the client 2's ID, which is 208, and it can already see game number 166 in the game list. Okay, so far so good. Now what we have done so far, we are able to get connected to the server and get client ID. Then we are able to create a new game, and we are able to see the games which are created, but they are waiting for player 2 to join here underneath this available games list. Now the next logic that we need to implement is that if you are player 2 or some other player, which in this case appears like this, so this is player 2, it has only been connected to the server, it has neither created a game nor joined any game, so that's why both the buttons are enabled. So the next logic that we need to implement is that other players are able to select one of those games when it click the game ID and then click join button. So whatever game ID was clicked last before clicking the join button, that game ID goes to the server as this player's or this client's request to join that particular game, and then server should be able to add this client ID with this game as second player. So first of all, we have to add some code to our client side such that when we click on any of the list item element and then click join button, the request goes to the server for as a client's request to join as player 2. So let's start coding. So the first thing is our list item should handle a click event. So we have to implement a click event for each list item element. So we have to go back to the part where we were creating list item elements, which was over here in the game list. So if you see, we are creating a new list item over here, then assigning game ID to it. We are then styling it to be centrally aligned, and then we are appending that list item to our unordered list. Now what shall we do? We can say list dot add event listener, which is click, and when we click this any of the list item, what shall happen is that we have this game ID variable defined over here, so that variable get updated with the current list items inner text. So we only need an arrow function because it will require just one line of code, which is game ID should be assigned whatever the value of that list item is. List item dot, so we can say list items are inner text or this game ID. So we are going to say this game, assign game. So this ID game should get assigned to game ID variable. So now what will happen if we have more than one game IDs and we keep on clicking on different IDs? So whatever is the last ID that we clicked on or last item that we clicked on, that ID will be stored in our game ID variable, in the client's game ID variable. Okay, once that happened, the second part is we have to have defined an event listener for our join button as well. So we have defined our join button over here. This join variable is a reference to our join button in our DOM. What we need to do, we have to define an event listener for the join button. So add event listener, we are interested in click event, and here what shall happen, this should send a request to the server that this particular client wants to join this particular game ID as its player number 2. So again, it's a simple 3 or 4 line statement maximum, so we are going to go for arrow function, and we will simply say socket dot send JSON dot stringify, and we have to pass in a parameter. That parameter first of all should contain a tag. So the tag is join, and now we need to send 2 pieces of information to the server, the client ID and the game ID, so that server knows that this particular client ID wants to be joined as player 2 in this particular game ID. So client ID and then game ID equals game ID. So whatever the latest value of game ID is, it's stored in this game ID variable. From that variable, that value is going to be sent to the server, and the client's ID, by the time a client clicks on the join button, he has already got his client ID, so that client ID is also sent to the server. So these are the 3 pieces of information that client needs to send. So it was a simple function, so we are defining the event listener for join button as an arrow function. So now we have to capture the complementing part in our server side. So again, let's go to our switch statement. Okay, we have to put a break. Now we have to start another case. So the case is the tag, which is join. So server has to handle the request for joining this particular client as player 2 for the game. So now at this point, the server has 2 pieces of information, client ID and game ID. Server will use this game ID to go to its games data structure, and from that data structure it will pick the right game object, and from that game object it will access the players array, and it will assign this second client as player number 2 in the game. So because this is going to be the player number 2, and as we know, for our player object it requires client ID is turn, which is going to be false for player 2, and the symbol of the player, which is going to be O, because X has been assigned to player 1. So let's define these attributes first. Say const player is an object with client ID comes from data dot client ID, and symbol is going to be O, and then is turn is false. Okay, now using the game ID we are going to access games data structure. So data dot game ID, from there we are going to access its players array, and to this players array we are going to push new player, which we just defined over here. Okay, now this game has been assigned 2 players, so it should be removed from the list of available games which are being displayed by every client who is currently connected. So we have to again call send available games function. So this will update the list of available games in every client. Okay, now to see the logic that we have defined so far is working, we are going to restart the server. Identifier player has already been declared. Line 66, okay, that we just defined. So this is a join over here, because constant has a kind of global scope. So the first player that we have defined while creating our game, so if we use the word constant player over here, and we are using again constant player in the join case as well, so that's why it's saying the identifier player has already been defined. So we need to replace this var and remove const from here. So this way the var has kind of scope throughout the switch, but because it's not constant, that means oh. So I should change this one to var. Okay. So with constant we cannot assign any variable a new object altogether. So therefore we have to replace the constant with the var, so that we are first defining an object, one object for player in our create case, and we are defining a totally new object and assigning it to player in our join case as well. So let's restart the server. So far working fine. Let's check. Okay, connect. Now create a game. So game 122 has been created. Now let's connect client 2 to the server. Connect. So its ID is 157. It can already see the available games over. So click and join. So the moment we joined, click on the join button, as you can see this game has been removed from the available games list. This happened because in our send available games function, the logic that we have defined is that it's going to get all the games from the game's data structure, and if any game object has less than 2 members assigned to it, only send those IDs to the client. And because this first player, when it created the game, it had only one player assigned, so we could already see it underneath available games list. And when second player joined that game, now the game has already got 2 players assigned, so that's why we can't see any more games available here to join. Okay, so far so good. Now the next part is the moment a game gets assigned 2 players, the server should send message to both of those players to start playing the game. And as a result, the first thing that we should notice on the client side is that the grid over here gets displayed. So let's start cracking that part now. Let's break that task into multiple smaller tasks, and the first task is going to be the moment a game gets 2 players assigned, each player should be able to see the grid in the right side window. So to do that, so at the end of this join case, we are going to send another message to both of the players. So we'll again say games data.gameID dot players dot for each, and player, and within the body we will get each player's connection from the client's data structure by saying player dot client ID and connection, and within this connection we are going to use the send function. This send function is going to use json.stringify, and within its object the first key value pair is going to be the tag. Let's call it joined. And does it need to send any other information? Well, there isn't any need to send any other information, but let's send game ID anyway. Game ID is game ID. Okay, now let's go back to the client side and handle this joined case. So here, create another case. And in this join case, we need only just 1 line. The first one is going to change the display property of the board div from none to grid. If you remember, in our CSS file, we had set the display property of the board div to none. So we are going to say document dot query selector. So the class name is board, and we want style dot display equals grid. Let's see if it works. Let's shut our server and restart it. Connect, create, connect, select 82 and join. Something wrong in our server. What is that? Cannot access game ID before initializing. Okay, so this is data.gameID. Connect, create, and connect, join. Okay, now we can see the grid over here, and we should be able to see the grid over here. Okay, so one step is done. Now what we need to do, when we hover over this grid, if this is player 1, we should be able to see an X instead of this pointer, and if we hover over here, because this is player number 2, we should be able to see a circle instead of this cursor. So we need to handle this part now. And we can do this by, maybe we need to add few more lines to joined case. Okay, I think when we send this joined message to the client, besides this game ID, we should also provide each player at least its symbol. So I'm going to add another key value pair. So symbol is going to be player dot symbol. Okay, now here in the client side, we have to define a global variable or symbol as well. Now this symbol sent by the server, we need to assign it to this client's own variable symbol. So we'll do that in over here in the joined case. So symbol is going to be data dot symbol. Okay. Once we got the symbol stored in the client's symbol variable, now based on the symbol, we have to add appropriate class to our board div. So we'll say if symbol equals x, then let's get a reference to the board div. Have we already got one? No, we haven't. Const board is document dot query selector, and the class is board. So now in this variable board, we have reference to our board div. So here we'll say if symbol equals x, then board dot class list dot add cross, else board dot class list dot add circle. Remember, these symbols are called class and circle in our CSS style sheet. So if we are getting X as symbol from server, that means we have to attach this keyword, this class cross to our board list. And if it's not X, then it must be O. So why bother checking about that? We directly put circle in there. Now let's shut our server and restart it, and let's give it another go. Connect, create. This is going to be client 2, connect, join. So see, this is because this is player 2, we can see circle, and here it is. Okay, that's enough for the joint. Now call the break. Okay, now next thing what happens is that, so if you notice, we are not able to click any of those cells. So our next job is to, when you click on any of these cells, if it is your turn, that symbol gets embossed in that grid cell. And if it's not your turn, you should not be able to get your symbol embossed on that cell. Okay, now to enable the players to be able to make a move, we have to send a message from the server. Depending on your turn, you are free to make a move. Once that message is sent by the server, we are going to make some progress in the client side as well. So a client is not allowed to make move unless it is instructed by the server, and once it makes a move, again it is disabled to make another move unless another message from the server comes that now it's your turn again to make another move. So at the end of this join case in the server side, we have to basically call another function which is update board method, and we are going to pass along the current game ID, that is data.game ID. Let's define this function. Update board game ID. Now, based on the provided game ID, we are going to access our games data structure, and from that games data structure, we will identify the particular object based on the game ID, and from that object, we will pick both the player's client ID, and using that client ID, we will again access our client's data structure, and from that data structure, we will pick the connection object, and using that connection object, we will instruct each client to make their move if it's your turn. Remember, in the beginning, is turn attribute of player 1 is true and is turn attribute of player 2 is false. So first thing first, let's pick the players array from the games data structure. So we'll say games and game ID. We are passing along this variable over here. Players dot for each. We'll use arrow function. Now we've got each player, so we are going to get player ID from the player object and use that player ID in our client's data structure. So we'll say clients player dot client ID. We are interested in connection of each player, and using that connection update, we are sending them a message. It has to be JSON message. So the first key value pair is going to be tag as always. And what should be the value of this tag? This tag should be, let's call it update board. And we have to inform each player that is it your turn or not. So the next part is turn. So is turn is, we are going to get this information from player dot is turn. We also need to send the current status of the board, which is going to be an array of empty strings at the moment, but we have to send it and it's going to be updated each time a player makes a move. Board, whatever the current state of the board is, which is again games, game ID dot board. Okay, that's it. So now we have to handle this message at the client side. So after the break, case update board. So in this part, what we need to do is we have to follow the same logic that we did with our available games list items. So first of all, we will erase all the symbols from different cells of the board at client side. And then depending on the respective value in the board array, if that particular element represents an empty string, we have to make the respective cell an empty cell as well. If the element contains an X, so we have to put a cross symbol in the respective cell. If that particular element in the board contains an O, so we have to put a circle in the respective cell. So first of all, we have to erase all the classes from the cell divs other than the cell class. So first of all, we need to have reference to our cell divs. So const sales document dot. So this time we are not going to use query selector, and instead we are going to use query selector all, because we have 9 divs in our HTML that have a class called sale. So it's a collection. So we need to use query selector all because this will return us a collection of divs, and each div has a class called sale. So now that collection is stored in our sales variable in JavaScript. Okay, now let's go back to our update board case. Now here we will iterate through the cells and we will remove all the classes to each cell except the cell class itself. So we'll say for sales.for each So I'll say if cell dot class list contains cross, we have to say cell dot class list dot remove cross. Else if cell dot class list dot contains circle, then cell dot class list dot remove circle. Okay, now we have clean slate. Now based on the current status of our board array that we have received from the server, we will again iterate through the board elements, and if that particular element of the board is empty, we will leave the respective cell empty. If that particular element of the board is X, we will put a cross to that cell as its class. The element of the board contains O, then we'll put a circle in the class list of that cell. So this time we have to iterate using the for loop that gives us index. So for I equals 0, I less than 9, because we have total 9 cells, I plus plus, if board at index I equals X, then cells at index I dot class list dot add cross. Else if board, okay, this is not just board, it is data.board, data.board, because this has come from the server side. Data.board equals an O, in that case cells at index I dot class list dot add circle. So otherwise don't do anything. Okay, so now we can see the previous state before making the move, and now we should be able to make our own move. So now we have to check is turn attribute, and if is turn is set to true, then that means it's your turn and you can make the move. Otherwise you can't make the move. So we'll say if data dot is turn, in that case call another function called make move. So you can't call this function if is turn for you is set to false. Okay, now let's define this function. Now within this make move function, all we need to do is we have to identify any empty cells that do not have either cross or circle embossed in them and they are empty. So we want to add an event listener to all such cells. So we'll say cells dot for each, and within the body of this arrow function, if not cell dot class list dot contains cross and not cell dot class list dot contains circle, that means it's an empty cell. So what we need to do, we have to add an event listener to that particular cell so that when we click on it, we can do further processing, that is make that symbol embossed in that cell. So it's a cell dot add event listener we are interested in click event listener, and what shall we call it? We are going to call it sale clicked event. So that's all we have to do in our make move function. Now let's define our sale clicked function. Sale clicked, and we are passing along the details of the event itself. Okay, now within the body of this sale clicked function, we need to imprint whatever the symbol of the player is. So if the symbol of the player is X and an empty sale is clicked, so we want to print that cross symbol in that particular sale. If the player symbol is O, so we want to print a circle within that sale. So we'll say if symbol equals X, let's create a method called, let's say, icon. Sorry, we are going to assign this icon cross else icon equals circle. Now we need to get the we need to access the particular sale which was clicked. For that we'll say source dot target dot class list dot 8, and we have to put icon over here. So this way, whatever particular sale was clicked, according to the symbol of the player, that particular symbol is going to be imprinted in that sale. Okay, once we get the symbol imprinted, now what we need to do, we have to update our board that will send back to the server. So for that, we have to create our own local board. Okay, now we need to iterate over those sales. If the class list contains cross, then we'll put X in the board. If the class list contains circle, then we'll put O in the board. And if the sale is empty, we will put an empty string in the board. So let's iterate over sales. We need to access the individual indexes. So therefore, we are using simple for loop. I equals 0. I less than 9 if sales I dot class list dot contains circle. In that case, board I assigned to board index I in O. Else if sales at index I class list contains cross, in that case board index I assign an X, otherwise board index I assign it an empty string. Okay, the next thing that we should do is that we have to make sure once a player gets a turn and he makes his move, he should not be allowed to make another move unless it's his turn again. To stop the player from making another move until his next turn, we have to basically remove all these event listeners that we have associated with each sale. So we will go through sales again. So we'll say sales dot for each and sale dot remove event listener, and the event listener, and the event is clicked, and the event listener is called sale clicked. Okay, we removed all the event listeners. Now since there isn't any event listener, no matter how many times you click on the sale, no symbol will get imprinted on that particular sale. when it's this player's turn again, so again make move will attach event listeners to empty cells, and then you will be able to make the move, and once you make the move, all the event listener will be removed from every cells again. Okay, now we are done with the client side logic. Now we have to send the updated board to the server again, so that server can check the current status of the board and figure out if somebody has already win the game, or is it a draw, or the game is still on, and send the updated board to every player so that next player can make his move. So we'll say socket.send, and the information that we need to send json.stringify. We have to pass along an object. The first thing is always the tag, which is going to help server uniquely identify the particular message sent from the client. So this time the client is trying to inform the server that a move has been made. So let's say move made is the tag. Okay, now the important information that the client need to send is the board, game ID, and client ID. Board is the local board variable defined in this class, in this method. The client who has made the move, his client ID, and particular game ID which is being. Okay, this is all the information that the client is sending to the server. So we have to handle this respective message at our server side. So let's go to our switch statement. So this is the last case, join, and let's put a break over here. And now the new case is move made. So this case is going to be executed when this particular message is sent by the client. Now within this move made, the first thing that a server needs to do is look at the board and try to figure out if anybody has already won the game, or if the game is in the draw state. Otherwise, change the is turn variables of both the players, and then again send this message update board to each player. These two messages will be keep on happening unless somebody has either won the game or it's a draw. So within this move made, first of all we have to get the new status of the board sent by the client and update the board information that is placed in the game's data structure for that particular game. So what we'll do, we'll say games, and here we have to figure out the game's ID which we have in our data. So we'll say data dot game ID. From that we will access its board, and to that board we will assign the new board sent by the client. So we are updating our board at the server side. So data.board. Now the board is updated. Okay, and now we need to check if somebody has already won the game or is it a draw. Once we have updated our board, the first condition that we need to check if a player has already won the game. So if that is the case, we have to send a certain message to both the players. Otherwise, you check if the game is in a draw state. In that case, you will send appropriate message to the players, and if not, then you will send this update board message again to indicate that the game is still on and the next player should make the move. Let's handle first condition. So let's create a variable is winner, and this is winner is going to call another function win state with the game ID passed along as a parameter. So data dot game ID. So we have to define this win state function. It is not defined yet. but it will return true if any player has won the game, otherwise it will return false. So we have to check if is winner. In this case, we have to send a unique message to both the players. So we'll say games data.gameID. From that, access players array, and for each player, access clients data structure, get its connection, get the connection of the client, and send the message. And the message is going to be again JSON object. You are basically telling the clients that the player who just made the move is the winner. So in that case, the tag should be winner and who has won the game. So for that, we're using key is winner, and as its value we should send player's symbol. If that is not the case, then what we need to check next is if the game is in draw state. So we are going to define another variable is draw. Again, this draw function is not defined, we have to define it yet, but we are passing along the game ID to it. And if the isDraw is true, that means the game is in the draw state. So we have to inform, again we have to inform the players. So I'm going to copy this part, insert over here, but this time the tag should game draw and we don't need to send any other information. Okay, and if that is not the case, so let me move this further up, insert over here, and make this one, instead of if, let's make it else if, so that if this part is true we don't move on to this part, and likewise we move on to this else part only if neither the game has been won by any player and nor is it in draw state. And in this part, before calling the update board method, we have to flip the isTurn values for both the players. So we'll say again games data.gameID dot players for each player, and we are going to set player.isTurn equals not player.isTurn. So if the current value of isTurn variable for player X is true, it will get set to false, otherwise it will get set to true. So once we have switched the isTurn values for both the players, now we can call the update board method again with the data.gameID. That's it. Break. And so now we have to define these two methods, win state and draw state. So let's go down here and define these two functions, and it gets passed on game ID as its parameter. So before we start coding winState function, we have to define an array which is going to represent all the possible winning states in a game. So we are going to call it winStates, and it's an array, and it consists of multiple arrays. So within this array we are going to have different arrays, and each of those arrays represents one possible winning state, and what are going to be the values of those arrays. So if we move back to our, let's say, connect, create, and so when we got this grid, so the first possible winning condition is if in this first row all the symbols are the same. So the index of this first cell is 0, 1, and 2. This is one winning state. Then 3, 4, 5 is another winning state. 6, 7, 8 is another winning state. Then we have to see the columns. So this is column 0, this is column 3, and this is column 6. So 0, 3, 6 is another winning state. Then this is column 1, this is column 4, and this is column 7. So 1, 4, 7 is another winning state. This is cell 2, this is 6 and 8. This is another winning state, and the third one, the last one, is diagonal. Index 0, then index 4, then index 8. 0, 4, 8. This is the last winning state. So let's go back to our code. So within this winStates array, we have another array. So index 0, 1, and 2. This is one possible winning state. Then another array. This is 3, 4, and 5. Third winning state, 6, 7, and 8. Now columns. So index 0, index 3, index 6. 0, 3, and 6. Now second column is going to be index 1, 4, and 7. 1, 4, and 7. Now last column, index 2, 5, and 8. 3. So index 2, 5, and 8. Now let's move on to diagonal. 0, 4, and 8. So these are the all possible combination of winning states. If any of these cells have same symbols, then we have found a winning state. So let's move back to our winning state, because this function is supposed to return a boolean value. So we'll say return winStates dot, within this winStates array, if some of those elements, and remember each element of this winStates array is again another array. So within that winStates array, if some of those elements satisfy this criteria, so we have to define this criteria. So if some of the elements of winStates array satisfies the criteria which we'll define here, then return true. And remember, sum means at least, so this sum will return true if at least one of the elements of the winStates array satisfies this criteria. So if the first element, which happens to be another array, if that array satisfies the criteria, we will get true. Otherwise it will check the second element, otherwise third, fourth, and if any of them gets the criteria satisfied, we will get true returned. So what is going to be the criteria? This sum is going to get an arrow function. So we are going to call each element arrow, because we know that each element is in the array. So within this row, so row happens to be an array itself. So we are going to again apply another element, which is going to be, sorry, row dot every. Now this time every element of the row must satisfy the criteria which we'll define over here. And if every element of the row satisfies this criteria, so you will be returned true. So this, and so what is the criteria? So now within the inner array, each item is actually an, let's call it sale because we have been calling it sale. So every cell must satisfy the criteria. And what is the criteria? That is, the criteria is it should return true if every cell has X in it or every cell has a Y in it. So we'll say return games game ID. We have to access its board member and which particular element of the board. So we will get this index from here, sale. So the row is going to return us the first element of WinStates, which is another array. And within this row, we are again iterating over every element. So first time, this cell is going to store the index 0. Second time, this cell is going to store index 1. And third time, this cell is going to have stored index 2. 0, 1, 2. And for the second row, cell is going to have index 3, 4 and 5. So this cell is basically is going to represent the indexes that we have in our WinState. So if that index has X in every element of each row, return true, or return true. Okay. We have put it under parentheses, and now we have to put an OR symbol, OR operator, and again we need to use this one again, copy, paste, and this time instead of X we are looking for O. So WinState is going to iterate over every element of our WinStates array, and if some of those elements in WinStates array satisfies this criteria, then it will return true. If none of them satisfies the criteria, then it will return false. And what is the criteria? The criteria is basically two things. First thing is, for each row, every element should have either X. If that is not the case, then it should have, every element should have O. If any of these two criteria are satisfied, a true will be returned. Otherwise, a false will be returned. So we are done with our WinState algorithm. Now let's move on to our function, which is what did we name our other? Is draw? No. WinState state draw. Let's make it draw state. Let's call it, okay, draw state. and again it is passed along the game ID. Now we have to use a similar logic over here. So our game is in draw state. If every row in our win states contains X as well as Y. So we have to return if it applies to every state. So therefore we are going to say win states dot every. Now because every element of the win state is a row, so we are using a row variable as a parameter. Now it should return something, and what is something is that basically we have to apply two more filters to it. So to each row we have to apply two more filters. The first filter is going to check if one of the elements in that particular row contains an X, and the second filter will check if one of the elements in that particular row contains an O. If both of these conditions are true, so then this should return true, and as a result the function will return true. Now we are saying if any element, so that means we are looking for some element which contains X. So we'll say row dot sum, it is cell games game ID dot board at index cell equals X. So this is one filter. We have to end it with another filter, which is again row dot sum cell, and this is game ID dot board at index cell equals NO. This should be returned, so let us put the return keyword over here, and likewise return. Okay, I think we have taken care of every possible logic for server side. Now we have to handle just two more cases at the client side, and those two cases are when the tag is winner and the tag is game draw. So let's go back to our cases, switch cases. Okay, let's put break over here. Now when the case is winner, in this case we are only getting this symbol that who is the winner. So we should display an alert, and this one should tell us the winner is. So this syntax is called a string interpolation. I hope you know about it, otherwise just search in the Google, you will find it. And in here I have to write data dot winner. So this will give us the symbol of the winner. Okay, let's break the case. Now the last case is this one, game draw. And in this case, let's display another alert with the message the game is a draw. Now let's restart our server. Connect, create, connect, join. So this is player 2 and it's player 1's turn. That's why when I'm trying to click, I don't see any circle imprinted on any of the cells. So let's hope it gets printed in our player 1. Okay, no. What's the problem? Move made is not defined. Okay, let's make move right. Restart the server. Connect, create. Let's give it a go. Okay, we see then X. Now hopefully when I try to click somewhere else, I should not be able to because it's not my turn anymore. So yeah, it's working. See, I'm clicking, but nothing happens because once I made this move, it is player number 2's turn. So let's go to player number 2. We should be able to see this cross imprinted over here in player 2 as well. So that means we need to check our code again. So once we have to check make move made. So let's try to display in the console the updated board in our game's data structure, and we should also display what did we get from the client. So data.board as well. Let's restart the server. Connect, create, connect, join. Cannot set property board of undefined. Oh, okay. This is game ID. Okay, we have made another mistake in our game ID variable name. Let's give another go. Connect, create. Let's create another client. Connect, join. Now we can see an X imprinted on player 2 as well. Now it's player 2's turn. So let me click over here. So now we can see a circle imprinted. Now if I try to click anywhere else, hopefully I should not be able to make next move because it's not my turn anymore. So see, it's working. Now let's move on to first player, and we can already see the circle over here, and it's player X turn. So let's put X over here. Let's go back to player 2, player 1. Now when I click over here, let's hope I will get the message that X is the winner. Okay, I didn't get this message. I've got an error. Okay, connection is undefined. At which line? 102. So I have to put player dot client ID. So if I have made the same mistake in the is draw as well, let me fix this. Client ID, restart our server, connect, create, connect, join. Good, X is the winner. Now let me restart the server and see if our is draw works properly as well. So connect, now. Oh, okay, yeah. So is draw is working as well. This is the end of our Tic Tac Toe using Websockets. It's a multiplayer game. Obviously, it is nowhere near completion. It needs a lot of improvements, but this is the basic, fully fledged working multiplayer game. I hope you have got the ideas and further improvements you can make on your own. Thank you so much, and if you like this tutorial, Please do subscribe. This will give me motivation to keep on making more videos. Thank you so much.